Moments after the U.S. delegation walked out of the Kremlin, everything changed. A high-level meeting between the United States and Ukraine, scheduled for weeks, prepared down to the last detail, was suddenly canceled on the spot. No delay, no reschedule, no explanation. Just a blunt message delivered in seconds. The meeting will not take place. In Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky was reportedly stunned, left without answers at a moment when Ukraine needed clarity more than ever. And in Brussels, where European officials had already gathered for what they believed would be a crucial three-way dialogue, a shockwave spread across the room as news broke that Washington was not coming. What happened? Why did the cancellation occur immediately after the U.S. delegation left the Kremlin? And what was said behind those closed doors that forced Washington to change course within minutes? Inside the Brussels meeting hall, the lights remained on, documents neatly arranged, translators waiting, security tightened. Everything was ready except the Americans. As minutes turned into hours, it became clear this wasn't a delay, it was a message. Meanwhile, Washington's silence was deafening. No statement, no clarification, no reassurance for Ukraine or NATO. And when observers noticed the U.S. plane flying directly back to Washington, bypassing Brussels completely, one question dominated every analysis on the continent. What did the U.S. hear or agree to in Moscow? In geopolitics, sudden moves are never random. They signal shifts, pressure, warnings, or new deals forming beneath the surface. And this cancellation, happening within mere minutes, may mark one of the most significant and alarming turning points in months. This is where the story begins. The unanswered question, what changed after Moscow? As the shock settled in Brussels, analysts across Europe rushed to piece together what might have triggered such an abrupt reversal from Washington. The timing was too precise, too sudden, and too coordinated to be a simple logistical issue. According to multiple diplomatic sources, the cancellation came less than 10 minutes after the U.S. delegation's motorcade left the Kremlin gates. That detail alone set off alarms. Initial reports suggest the discussions inside the Kremlin were far more intense and far more consequential than expected. The length of the meeting, the absence of any public briefing, and the unusually stern expressions on the faces of U.S. officials all hinted at a private negotiation that may have contained either a direct warning, a strategic demand, or classified intelligence that forced Washington to rethink its next steps. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the mood shifted from confusion to anxiety. Zelensky's team understood the symbolism. When the United States skips a meeting with Ukraine right after speaking with Russia, the message, intentional or not, is unmistakable. It signals uncertainty. It signals recalculation. And above all, it signals that something significant may have been discussed in Moscow that Ukraine was not part of. European diplomats described the moment as one of the most unsettling signals in months. Some privately fear this could indicate early stages of a major strategic shift, possibly involving pressure on Ukraine to soften its stance in future negotiation. What remains undeniable is this: Washington's silence is speaking louder than words. And until the U.S. clarifies its position, the entire region is left to guess what truly happened behind those closed doors. The turning point came the moment the U.S. delegation exited the Kremlin grounds. Observers stationed near the building noticed something striking. The American officials walked out with no press briefing, no eye contact with reporters, and no customary diplomatic remarks. Their expressions were tight, their pace unusually quick. It looked less like the end of a scheduled meeting and more like the aftermath of an unexpected confrontation. Minutes later, the motorcade sped toward the airport under heightened security. And then, the moment that changed everything, As soon as the U.S. plane lifted off from Moscow, the Brussels meeting disappeared from Washington's schedule. No transition period, no internal memo, just an immediate, complete cancellation. European officials waiting in Brussels described receiving the news with disbelief. To them, this meeting was not symbolic, it was strategically essential. It was where Ukraine hoped to secure assurances, where NATO expected clarity, and where the U.S. would typically reaffirm its role as the backbone of European security. Instead, the message delivered was one of absence, silence, and uncertainty. Compounding the shock, flight trackers revealed that the U.S. delegation's jet changed route midair, skipping Brussels entirely and heading straight back to Washington, D.C. That decision, visible to the public in real time, sparked a wave of speculation across diplomatic circles. Did the Kremlin deliver a warning, a proposal, a line that Washington felt it could not cross? Whatever happened inside that closed room, it triggered an immediate operational shift, something serious enough to override weeks of planning with Ukraine. And from this moment on, analysts agree, the balance of the conflict may have begun shifting in real time. 5 leading theories. Why did the U.S. cancel the meeting? The sudden cancellation of the U.S.-Ukraine meeting has ignited a wave of speculation across global intelligence and diplomatic networks. With Washington silent and Moscow offering no clues, analysts have identified 5 primary theories, each pointing to a different and potentially alarming strategic shift. A critical warning from Russia. Some believe the Kremlin delivered a message so serious, military, nuclear, or geopolitical, that Washington had no choice but to rethink its immediate commitments. A scenario like this could force the U.S. to pause all secondary meetings, pressure on Ukraine to adjust its strategy. Another theory suggests Washington is losing patience with Kyiv's internal issues. Corruption, political infighting, or resistance to certain negotiation frameworks. Canceling the meeting sends a blunt signal. We set the conditions now. 3. Avoiding direct escalation with Moscow. With global tensions rising, the U.S. may be recalibrating to prevent an accidental confrontation with Russia. Canceling a visible pro-Ukraine engagement right after Kremlin talks could be a strategic de-escalation move. A possible U.S.-Russia back-channel deal. This is the most controversial theory. Some analysts suspect Washington and Moscow may be exploring a framework, temporary or partial, to stabilize the region. In such early-stage talks, Ukraine might not be included. New classified intelligence received in Moscow. The fastest way to cancel a meeting is when new intelligence changes the risk landscape instantly. If U.S. officials received alarming data, military or political, they would prioritize urgent consultations in Washington over any planned meeting. While none of these theories have been confirmed, the speed and precision of Washington's decision suggest one thing. Something significant happened inside the Kremlin, and the ripple effects may only be beginning. The impact on Ukraine, Zelensky left with no ground to stand on. For Ukraine, the sudden cancellation of the U.S. paused Ukraine meeting was more than an embarrassing diplomatic setback. It was a strategic shockwave. Inside Kyiv, officials described the moment the news arrived as a cold silence spreading through the room. President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had placed enormous hope in the Brussels meeting, was said to be stunned, unable to understand how such a crucial engagement simply vanished without explanation. The timing made everything worse, a cancellation immediately following U.S. talks in Moscow sends a message Kyiv did not want to hear. Washington may be recalculating. Within hours, Zelensky's advisors scrambled to assess the implications. Emergency briefings were held, intelligence channels activated, and diplomatic missions contacted for clarity. but no clarity came. Washington remained silent. European partners were just as confused. And that silence, more than the cancellation itself, became the source of Ukraine's deepest anxiety. Domestically, the reaction was swift and emotional. Ukrainian media questioned whether U.S. support was weakening. Social networks filled with speculation and fear. Citizens, already exhausted by war, wondered whether a shift in American policy could mean fewer weapons, fewer commitments, and fewer guarantees. Behind closed doors, Kyiv confronted a difficult reality. If the United States is recalibrating its strategy, Ukraine could lose the strongest pillar of its defense. This uncertainty affects everything: military planning, diplomatic moves, and public morale. Even a temporary pause in U.S. engagement forces Ukraine into a vulnerable position, signaling to both allies and adversaries that Kyiv may be standing on increasingly unstable ground. For Zelensky, the most painful part is not knowing why this happened. For Ukraine, the fear is not knowing what comes next. The abrupt cancellation of the U.S.-Ukraine meeting is more than a diplomatic disruption. It is a signal, a sharp, unexpected shift that has left Kyiv, Brussels, and Washington in a state of uneasy silence. What happened inside the Kremlin clearly carried enough weight to trigger an immediate reversal of plans, override weeks of preparation, and send shockwaves through Europe's political core. But perhaps the most unsettling part is this: no one is explaining why. Washington has offered no statement, Ukraine has received no clarity, Europe is left guessing. And when silence replaces diplomacy, it often means one thing: the real conversation is happening somewhere else, behind doors the public will never see. Whether this moment marks a temporary recalibration or the beginning of a much larger strategic shift remains unknown. But one reality is impossible to ignore: the stakes have changed. The balance of power is shifting, and every nation involved can feel it. Ukraine now faces a future defined by uncertainty. Europe watches nervously, fearing a possible redrawing of alliances. And the United States, by remaining silent, has left the world debating what its next move will be. In geopolitics, sudden moves are rarely accidental. They are warnings. They are signals. They are the first tremors before a major change. The question now is simple yet deeply unsettling. What happened in Moscow that changed everything within minutes?